So in the last video, we built our sign up and sign in pages, and then we were able to log in and it redirected us into the dashboard page, as you can see right here. So let's go ahead and fix this error first of all. So the way we do that is, remember that we created this route group called dashboard. So we want to go ahead and create a new folder called dashboard, which is now going to create the route called /dashboard. And then inside this, we're going to create the page.jsx, and then you can say RFC, and then change this into dashboard page, and you can save that. Now this error should go away and we should now see dashboard page on the screen. And there we go. Now before we can go ahead and deal with our dashboard page, we need to go ahead and set up our Convex backend, because we already need to start depending on the data that we're getting back from our Convex inside our dashboard page. So the way that we're going to do that is, remember that we run npx convex dev, which is currently running in this first terminal, and that created the Convex folder that we're seeing right here. So we're going to go inside this Convex folder. We're going to create a new file called schema.js, which is a unique file in Convex that defines your database schema. So if you open up your terminal again, you should notice that we are going to have an error from Convex because this file is empty, as you can see right there. So the way we fix it is by defining our schema. So we're going to go ahead and say import define schema, and it's not giving me the imports. So define schema and then define table. This is coming from convex /server, and then we need to import v from convex values. And then in order to just quickly go ahead and fix this error, you can say export default define schema, and then open this up. We want to define a users table. So users and then define table. How do you want to define this table? It's going to have the clerk ID, which is the unique ID that you get when you sign up using clerk, and this is going to be a type of v.string. So let's just go ahead and save that so that this error goes away, so that I can also show you that if you go into your Convex, reload this. Okay, so we need to go into our dashboard, and then inside our dashboard we're going to be able to preview our databases. We can close down this tab from clerk, we're not using it anymore. So this is the Convex application that we created. So if we open it up, and make sure that you're using the development one. If you accidentally chose the production, you're not going to be able to do quite a few things. So just make sure that you're in the development tab, and then you can go into your data tab right here, and you'll notice that we have just defined the table that is called users. If you try to add a new document inside here, you'll notice that the users only requires the clerk ID, because that is what we have required inside here. But if you go ahead and continue building it out, because it requires quite a few things, so the email v.string, and then the name v.string, and then the profile image v.optional, and then v.string, and then the bio of the user, so v.optional, v.string, and then the location v.optional, v.string, and then the phone number v.optional, v.string, and then we have the preferences, which is v.optional, but it's v.object inside. And then open this up. We want to check for the pet type v.optional, and then v.array, because you can have a preference of more than one pet, v.array, and then inside this v.string. So it's going to be an optional array of strings. The elements are going to be strings. And then let's copy this down 2 more times, because we want to check for the size preference, and we also want to check for the age preference. Now in this case, they're all going to be v.optional, and then array, and then string, and then the age is also going to be optional, array, and then string. And then we can copy this down 1 more time. We want to check for the activity level, and in this case it's not going to be an array, but it's going to be v.string. And then copy this down 2 more times. This is going to be checking for the living space, and it's v.optional and then v.string, and then we want to check for the experience, so the experience that you have with pets. And then you can go, the users table ends where? Right here. So you can go below this. We also want to have the created art, which is v.number, and then we want to have the updated art, which is v.number, like so. Now when we are searching through this database, because we are assuming that probably we're going to have, I don't know, maybe 1 million users, so we want to be able to query this database. So we can do that by adding indexes in Convex. So you want to index this by the clerk ID, meaning when you're querying the database, you want to use the clerk ID, which is unique to every user. And then we're going to pass in the clerk ID, like so. Now, if I go ahead and save that, what you notice is that Convex is going to update automatically without having to reload. And if you try to add a document here, and come on, messing me up. We'll try to add a document here. Really? Okay, let's reload it. So once again, let's try to add a document. You'll notice that now we have the clerk ID, the created at the email, the name, update that showing here, but it's not showing all these others because they're all optional. So it's only showing you the required values. Okay, let's go ahead and continue creating our database. So we want to create another table here called pets. So pets and then define table. Open this up. We want to have the owner ID, which is coming from v.id from the users table. We want to have the name of the pets, which is v.string. We want to have the type of the pet, which is v.string. So it can be like a dog or a cat or a bird or whatever you want. And then the breed, which is v.string. So these are all required. And then the age is v.number. And then the size is v.string. Why do I keep pressing 0? And the size in this case, small, medium, large. And then the gender is v.string. And then we have the description, which is v.string. And then we have the images, which is v.array, and then v.string, because we're going to be adding in many images. And then whether the pet is available, so is available is v.boolean. And then the activity level is v.string. And then we want to check good with kids, which is v.string. And what good with kids is not v.strings, it is a boolean. So it's you're either good with kids or not, or rather the pet is either good with kids or not, so boolean. And then let's copy this down 2 more times, because the next one that we're checking is good with pets. So is it good with other pets, which is v.boolean. And then we want to check for is house trained, which is v.boolean. And then medical info, so medical info is v.optional, and then v.string. And then the adoption fee, so adoption fee is v.optional, and then v.number. And then we need to check for the location, which is v.string. We need to check for the created art, which is v.number. And then we need to check for the updated art, which is v.number as well. And then the way that we're going to be searching through this database, we're going to have an index here. So we want to index by _owner, and then we're going to pass in the owner ID. And then we also want to index this by the type of pet, so by type, and then we're going to pass in the type. And then we also want to index it by availability, so by availability, and then I'm going to pass in the is available. So the next table that we need to create is called adoption applications. So define table, open this up. We will need to get the pet ID, which is coming from v.id from the pets table that we've just created above. We need to have the applicant ID, which is coming from v.id from the users table. The owner ID is coming from v.id from the users table as well. We need to have the status, so v.string, so whether it is pending, accepted, or rejected. And then we need to get the application data, which is v.object. And the application data in this case is the experience of the person, so experience, which is v.string. We need to get the living space, which is v.string. The work schedule, which is v.string. We need to get the other pets, whether they have other pets or not, so v.string. We need to have the reason for adoption, so why do you want to adopt, v.string. And am I doing this correctly? Okay. And then we need to have the references, if they have any referees or not, so v.optional and then v.string. And then we need to have the additional info, which is once again optional, so v.optional and then v.string, like so. And then we need to pass in the created art, which is v.number. And then we need to pass in the updated art, which is v.number once again. And then we're going to be indexing this table, so index, we want to index it by the pet, then pass in the pet ID. We also want to index by the applicant, so by applicant. And how do we search for an applicant? We search for using the applicant ID. And then we also want to index it by the owner, so by owner. And then we're going to pass in the owner ID, like so. You can save that. And then the next table that we need to create is the messages table, so define table. Open this up. The messages table is going to have the application ID, which is coming from v.id from the adoption applications table, so adoption applications table, which I've just created above. It's going to have the sender ID, which is v.id from the users table. It's going to take the receiver ID coming from v.id from the users table. It's going to have the content, so whatever you're sending, so v.string. And then the created art is going to be v.number. Okay, and then we're going to index this by the application, so by application. And then we're going to pass in the application ID. We want to index this also by the sender, so by underscore sender, I should say. This is going to take in the sender ID. And then also want to index it by receiver. This is going to take in the receiver ID, like so. And then finally, we're going to have a notifications table, so define table. This is going to take in the user ID as v.id from the users table. It's going to take in the notification type, which is going to be v.string. So it can be like an adoption request or an application update or a message. So if someone sends a message, you're going to receive a notification, and so on and so forth. The title is going to be v.string. The message is going to be v.string. The is read, so whether it has been read or true, is going to be v.boolean. What did I say? It has been read or true. It has been read or not. And then the related ID, it's going to be v.optional, and then v.string. And then the created art is going to be v.number. So the related ID is basically if it is a reply to a message, then it's going to show you that someone replied to your message, which is this, and then or someone replied to your application, something like that. And then we're going to be indexing this by underscore user. Then we're going to pass in the user ID. And then we also want to index this by read status, so read or not status. We're going to pass in the user ID and then pass in the is read as well. Fantastic. So if you Control J and then save your schema, you'll notice that it's going to do some things inside here. There we go. And then once it's done, you'll notice that without reloading, it creates all the tables that we have just been typing out inside here. Very, very nice. So now we can actually begin to work on the dashboard. So jumping back inside our dashboard, before you can begin typing away, I just want to mention that this is a very huge project. So we're going to be jumping back and forth between Convex and our UI. So just be prepared for that. And it's going to begin in this very file. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create we're going to mark this file as use client. And then we're going to begin to set up our imports. So we want to import use query, which is coming from Convex React. We want to import the use user hook from Clark Next.js. We want to import API from Convex generated API. We want to import a component that is called pet card, which we don't have, which comes from art/components/pet card, pet-card. And then we want to import the button component from shardcn. We want to import the card, and then card content, then card description, and then card header, and then card title. And then we also want to import the PowerPrint from Lucid React, and then the settings icon from Lucid React as well. And then we can now import the link component from NextLink. And then we can begin to set up our dashboard. And actually, before we do that, let's go ahead and create this component because we're going to forget it. So inside components, create a new file called pet-card.jsx. And then inside you can say rfc, and then enter, change this into pet card like so. Save that, and then you can begin, or rather you can continue building this out. So we're going to destructure the user from use user, which is coming from Clark. And then we want to go ahead and get the current user that is logged in, that has been saved into Convex. So we're going to say const current user is equal to use query, and then we're going to pass in API dot users dot get user by Clark ID. Now this is a Convex function that we need to create, so we don't yet have it. So if we were to save it, then our application would break. So inside here, we're going to check if the user .id exists. So if that is true, then you want to pass in the Clark ID as the user.id. Otherwise, we want to skip the query. And then we want to also check for recommended pets. So const recommended pets is equal to use query, they import use on top right here. I do not want to import that. So use query, and we're going to say api.pets.get recommended pets. Once again, we don't have this function. This is going to be taking the current user !_id, because in Convex the ID is set as _id. So if that is true, then we want to pass in the user ID as current user !_id, and then also want to pass in the preferences of the person, so preferences as current user .preferences. And then otherwise, if that it does not exist, then we want to skip the query like so. And then below this, we're going to say if there is no current user. So if there is no current user, then we're going to go ahead and simply return the loading spinner component that we already created. And then otherwise, we're going to start to build out our return. So you can have a div here with the class name of mx-auto, mx-auto, then max width -7xl, and then padding all round of 6. And then inside here, we can build out the welcome section. So adding a comment because it's going to be easier. So we're going to have a div here with the class name of margin bottom of 8, and then inside this div, we're going to have an h1 with a class name of margin bottom of 2, text -3xl, and then font bold. And then inside you're going to say welcome back, comma, and then open up your curly brackets, pass in user !firstname, and then exclamation at the end. And then below the h1, you're going to have a paragraph. This paragraph is going to say discover your perfect pet companion based on your preferences. preferences, like so. Now I can go ahead and save that, but our application is going to break because we don't have these two functions. So let's go ahead and create these two functions. And how do we do that? We know that we are accessing Convex using the API, so we just need to create the file called users and then create this function inside. So you can see that it already breaks. So inside Convex, we're going to create a new file called users.js, and then we also need to create a new file called pets.js. And the reason for that is because we need to get this function from pets. So let's go ahead and create the current user function first of all. So the current user function is getting the user by the clerk ID. So we're going to say export const get user by clerk ID and make sure that the function names match, and we're going to import query here. So we need to import query, which is coming from /generated/server. So this is going to take in the arguments as the clerk ID, which is coming from v.string, and then we're going to say the handler is going to be an asynchronous function. And take note that, see how we have an infinite loading right here? It's because we are saying that if there is no current user, and we know that there is no user, right? So if there's no user, then we get an infinite loading. So the handler here is going to take in the context and then the arguments, and then we're going to say return await context.db.query, and we're querying the users table with index. So we are querying it with the index of by clerk ID. Remember that we created it. And then we're going to pass in our callback function here called query. We're going to say query.equals, and then we want to pass in the clerk ID and then compare it with the arguments.clerk ID. And then dot first, so return the first one that matches. So that's basically how you create that function. So now once Convex reruns, let's see, you should be able to access that function. And we're getting an error here that v is not defined because we need to import it. So right here from Convex values. And let's jump inside pets. Let's create our function. So we need to import, first of all, v from Convex values. And then we also need to import query from ./generated server. And then we can go ahead and say export const get recommended. What was it called? It's called get recommended pets. So just copy and paste it here. This is going to be a query where we're going to have some arguments here, which are quite a number of arguments. It's going to have the user ID as v.id from the users table. We're going to have the preferences, which is v.optional. And you know what? It's going to be easier if we just copy this from the schema because we have done it already. So you just need to find where the pets are, the pets table. We just need to find this part right here. So I can just copy this part for the preferences and then paste it here. So we're checking for the preferences. We want the pet type, which is v.optional, v.array, and then string, the size, and then the age, and then activity level, living space, and the experience as well. And then our handler function is going to be an asynchronous function, taking the context and then the arguments like so. And this is going to be a long function. So we're going to say let pets equals to await context.db.query, and we're querying the pets table with index of by availability. And then we're going to pass in our callback function here. We're going to say query.equals, and then pass in the is available, check for is available rather, and then check whether is available is true, and then dot collect like so. So basically we want that in your preferences you only see the pets that are available for adoption. Now next thing we need to do is we need to filter out pets that are owned by the user so that they don't appear in your preferences, right? So we're going to say pets is equal to pets.filter, and then for every pet that you get back, check that the pet.owner ID is not equal to the arguments.user ID like so. So that's how you filter them out. And then we want to say that if there are no preferences, if no preferences, then return all available pets. So we're going to say if no arguments.preferences, then we're going to say return pets.slice and then get the first 12 of them, so 0, 12. And that is basically just a limit for the home page. You can remove it if you want. That is basically my preference. Now, once you do that, then we're going to go ahead and apply the recommendation logic. So we're going to go ahead and destructure. So let's say const, and then we want to get the pet type and the size and the age and the activity level. These are all coming from arguments.preferences that we have on top. So we're going to say if the pet type and the pet type.length is greater than 0, if that is true, then we're going to say that pets is equal to pets.filter, and then for every pet that we get back, then the pet type dot includes, and then pass in the pet dot type. So, and then we're going to have another if statement here, and it is going to be very similar to this, so you can just copy and paste it down. So this one is checking if size, so Control D to highlight the three of them, then change that into size. So if size and the size.length is greater than 0, then the pets is going to filter and then add in the pet.size, and then copy this down one more time, change this, highlight it, simply highlight it, then Control D to add multiple cursors, change this into activity level. And activity level here is not what's it called? It's not an array, so we're not mapping over them. So if activity level, then the pets is equal to pets filter, and then activity level, this should not be this. So we're going to say, what is it? Activity level, rather pet.activity level is triple equal to the activity level, like so. And then next we want to check for the preference of age. So if age and age.length is greater than 0, then we're going to say pets is equal to pets.filter, and then for every pet that we get back, then we're going to return age.sum, and then pass in the age range as follows. Oops, open this up, and then having a switch statement. So switch and then pass in the age range, open this up again, and then in the case that you want a young pet, then we're going to be returning the pets age, which is less than or equal to 2 years old. And then in the case that you want an adult, then we're going to return the pet.age, which is greater than or equal to 3, but less than pet.age less than or equal to 7. So that is an adult pet. And then in the case that you want a senior pet, then we're going to return the pet.age, which is greater than or equal to 8 years old. And then the default case is going to be saying return true. Now let's go below all this right here, and what we're going to do is the following. If there are no preferences, then return some random pets. So return random pets. So we're going to say if pets.length is triple equal to 0, then pets is equal to await context.db.query, and we are querying the pets table with index of by availability, then having our callback function here, query.equals, then passing is available, check for whether it is true, and then dot collect, so get all of them. And then we're going to say pets is equal to pets.filter, and then for every pet that we get back, then we want to return the pet.owner ID not equal to the arguments.user ID. So basically don't show the pets that the user owns. And then below this, we're going to go ahead and say return pets.slice and get the first 12. So 0, 12, like so. And that is our recommendations. So we can go ahead and save that. So our convex functions are now running, but you can see that we are still getting the infinite loading. Well, that is because the way we set up our dashboard page is that it is checking for if there's a current user, and if there's no current user, then it's returning an infinite loading. But where's the user coming from? The user is coming from Convex. Now, we logged in but the user is not being saved to Convex because we don't yet have that Convex mutation to save the user in Convex. So let's go ahead and do that. And how do we do that? Remember that the dashboard is a route group. So because it is a route group, we can create a layout file inside here. So layout.jsx, so that inside this layout file, we can simply check for whether the user is signed in or not, and whether they are stored in Convex without having to check for that in every single page. So inside this layout, we're going to be doing the following. We're going to mark it as use client, and then we're going to say import use user from Clark. We're going to import the use router. We're also going to import the use effect, and we also need to import the use state as well. So use state, we need to import use query, and we need to import the use mutation. We need to import API, and then we need to import a component that we don't yet have called sidebar from /components /layout /sidebar, and then another component which is called the header. So these two components, let's go ahead and create them. So components, create a new file called what's happening? Create a new file here called layout /sidebar.jsx. Let's say RFC inside here. Not doing anything. Export default function sidebar, return sidebar, or the div that says sidebar. My extensions are broken. Let's save that. Let's create another file here inside the components, inside layout. Create a new file called header.jsx. Paste this in, change this into header like so. Save that, and then we can continue building out our homepage, rather the dashboard layout. So we can say export default function dashboard layout, and because it's a layout, then it is wrapping every other component, so we can access the children. And then I'm going to say const is signed in. Why are my functions not working? I need to fix this. Now let's just continue. So is signed in, and then is loaded, and then the user. This is all coming from use user, and then const router is coming from use router, and then const sidebar open, and then set sidebar open. This is coming from use state, and by default it is going to be false. And then const create user is going to be coming from a use mutation from api.users.create user. So we don't yet have this function, we're going to create it. And then const current user is equal to use query. Now we already created this function before, so you can copy paste it if you want. So api.users.get user by Clark ID. Remember that this checks for the user !ID. If that is true, then we want to pass in the Clark ID as user.id. Otherwise, we want to skip the query. And then we're going to call our use effect inside here. So inside this use effect, this is where we're going to be checking for if is loaded and not is signed in is true, then router.push and push them into the /auth/sign in page. And you know what, the auth is a route group, so it should just go into the /sign in like so. And then the dependency array for the use effect here is the is signed in, and then is loaded, and then router. And then below this, we're going to have another use effect, which is going to create the user in Convex. So the dependency array for this one is going to be user, current user, and create user function. So inside this, we're going to say if there is a user and there is no current user, it means that the user is signed in, but they have not been saved to Convex because current user is using Convex. So if that is the case, then we want to create the user in Convex, and we're going to create user using Clark ID. So Clark ID, which is coming from user.id. We're going to have the email, which is user.email, addresses, and this is all data from clerk. Get the first one, question mark dot email address if it exists. If it doesn't exist, then simply return an empty string. And then the name is going to be user dot full name if it exists, or if it doesn't exist, then we want to open up our template literals and then $ curly bracket user dot first name, and then attach also the user dot last name, like so. And if that doesn't exist, then simply return user. And then for the profile image, we're going to say user dot image URL if it exists, otherwise return undefined, like so. And then below this use effect, we're going to say check for if not is loaded, or not is signed in. Then we're going to go ahead and return the loading spinner component, so. And then finally below this, we can set up our return. So our return, we're going to be returning a div with a class name of main height dash screen, and then bg gray dash 50. And then on large screens, we're going to say lex. And then inside, you're going to render out the sidebar component. The sidebar component is going to be taking the is open prop, which is going to be calling the sidebar open. So sidebar open, which is our state value. And then it's going to take on close, which is a function here, which is basically going to be an inline function that says set sidebar open to false. And then below the sidebar, we're going to have a div with a class name of on large screens flex-1, so that it takes up the entire remaining space. Inside here, we're going to have the header component. The header takes in the on menu click prop, which is going to be an inline function that says set sidebar open into true, like so. And then close that out. And then below this, we're going to have a main element with a class name of padding on the top of 16. And then this is going to be rendering out the children, like so. Now we can save that, and hopefully inside Convex, we should see a new user being registered. If I reload this actually, then the new user should be registered, hopefully. And there we go. So we're getting issues here, but let me wait for it to finish reloading. We're getting issues that says create user. Oh yes, create user. We have not created that function. Okay, so let's go ahead and create it. So we are not going to see anything inside here. So let's go ahead and get the create user function. So for create user, we're going to jump into Convex. Let me make this full screen. So inside Convex, we already have the users.js. So you can just go on top of this, and then you can say export const create user. This is going to be equal to a mutation, not a query. So mutation I can spell, which is also imported from /generated server. The mutation takes in some arguments inside here. It takes in the clerk ID as v.string. It takes in the email as v.string. It takes in the name as v.string, and then it takes in the profile image as v.optional, and then v.string. What might I make? Like so. And then for the handler function, handler is an asynchronous function, as it is with every Convex function that we're going to create. So it takes in the context and the arguments. And first of all, we want to check if there is an existing user, because we don't want to create multiple users with the same data. So const existing user is equal to await context.db.query, and we're querying the users table with index of by clerk ID. And we're going to pass in a callback here. We're going to say query.equals check for the clerk ID compared to the arguments.clerk ID, and then get the first one that matches. And then once you do that, we want to check if existing user is true. Then simply return the existing user dot underscore ID. And then if it is not, then we want to create the new user. So const user ID is equal to await context.db.insert, and we're inserting into the users table, and we are inserting everything in the arguments, so spreading out every other thing in the arguments. And then we want to attach the created at as date.now, because if it is a new user, then they have just been created at that particular time. And then the updated art as well is going to be date.now, because once again they're a new user, so created art and updated art is going to match. And then finally below this, we're going to say return user ID. That's all. Now we can save that, Control G to open up your terminal, ensure that this is giving you a nice green tick. And there we go. And then if we check Convex, if we reload perhaps this, if we reload it, then you have Convex. Look at that, looking very nice. So this is what we already began building. And now there we go. Look at that. So the user has been created without having to reload. That is really something that I like about Convex, because it is described as a reactive database. Now you can see that the user has a bunch more data that is not filled. That is because this other data is all optional. And once we get into building the profile pages, then we're going to be able to insert this data in your database if you want. But for now, we need to go ahead and continue building the dashboard page. So let's jump back inside the dashboard and then inside the page.jsx. Let's close out these other files. You know, close everything to the right, like so, that we remain with the page, and then we can continue building it. So as we continue to build out this page, I just want to mention that since we don't have any data about the pets in the database, we are going to be seeing only the empty state until we get to the page where we're going to be creating the pets inside the database. So for now, let's just go ahead and build it. So below this paragraph and then below this div, we're going to create some cards inside here, which are going to show if you don't have any preferences yet. So we're going to go ahead and open up our curly brackets and check for if there's no current user preferences. So if no preferences exists, then we want to go ahead and open up the card component here. The card component is going to have a class name of margin bottom of 8, and then border orange -200, and then bg orange -50. And then inside the card, we're going to have the card header. And you know what, something is bothering me. I set this to bg gray somewhere. I set it to bg gray somewhere, so let's just search for where we have bg gray. Not, it's inside the layout, inside the dashboard layout. Let's remove this, save it, and then let's continue building it out as it is reloading. There we go. I think probably, maybe that is better. If I don't like it, then I'm just going to change it back to bg gray, because that is what I used when I was building it out. So inside the card header, we're going to have card title. Card title is going to have a class name of flex, then item center, then text orange -800. And then inside here, we're going to be rendering the settings icon. The settings icon is going to have a class name of margin right of 2, and then size -5. Below the settings icon, we're going to have some text that says set your preferences. Let's capitalize it, preferences. And below the card title, we're going to have card description. Card description is going to have a class name of text -orange -700. The text is going to say, help us find the perfect pets for you by setting your preferences in your profile settings. Stop. And then we're going to go below the card header. We're going to have card content. Card content is going to be having a link component from next link. It's going to be going into the href of /dashboard/settings, like so. And then we're going to be rendering out the button component. The button is going to have a class name of bg orange -50. And then on hover, we're going to say bg orange -600. And then the text is going to say update preferences. Let's capitalize it as also preferences. You can save that. Let's see what I have on the screen. What is happening inside here? This should say 500. Okay. And okay, yeah, so I've just noticed that I think let's just trace this back into bg gray -50. I think that is going to be a better contrast. Yeah, I think that's okay. So update preferences. Now I know that we're going to be using this button elsewhere in our application. So instead of having to have all the class names like this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to edit the entire button file. So simply control and then click on this, which is going to take you into this button. And then the variant that I want to edit is the default one, because the default one is the one that is showing currently, as you can see, this dark one. So instead of BG primary, I want BG orange -500. And then on hover, I want BG orange -600. So simply edit that variant, and then now anytime that you use the button without passing in a variant, the default one is the one that is going to apply, as you can see right there. Now below the card and then below this, we're going to go ahead and show the recommendations. So if you have your preferences, then it's going to recommend some pets for you. So you're going to return a div with a class name of space on the y of 6, and then another div with a class name of flex, and then items-center, items-center, then justify-between, and then inside this we're going to have an h2 with a class name of text-2xl, then font-semi-bold, and then the text is going to say recommended for you. And then below the h2 we're going to render out a link component with an href that is going into the /dashboard/discover, and then inside here we're going to have the button component with a variant of outline, and then the text is going to say view all pets. And then we're going to go below this link, below this div, we want to check for recommended pets. So recommended pets, if that is true, and the recommended pets length is greater than 0, if that is true, then we want to return something, and then if it is false, we also want to return something else. So if it is true, we're going to return a div, and this div is going to have a class name. So class name of grid -columns-1, give it a gap of 6. On medium screens, grid columns-2. On large screens, grid columns-3. And then inside this div, we're going to say recommended pets.slice, and we want to get the first 8 of them, and then map over that. So dot map. Then for every pet that we get back, we want to go ahead and return the pet card component, which we already imported, and this is going to have a key of pet._id, and then it's going to take in the pet as pet, and then the current user ID as current user._id, like so. Otherwise, right inside here, we're going to return a card with a class name of padding on the y of 12, and then text-center, and then inside this card we're going to have the card content. The card content, inside this we're going to have the paw print icon. So paw print, the paw print icon is going to have a class name of text gray -400 mx auto, and then margin on the bottom of 4, and then size -12. And then below this we're going to have an h3 with a class name of margin bottom of 2, and then text-large, and then font-semi-bold, and then the text is going to say no pets found, so. And then below the h3 we're going to have a paragraph with a class name of margin bottom of 4, and then the paragraph is going to say we couldn't find any pets matching preferences. Try updating your settings or browse all available pets. And then below this, the paragraph, we're going to have a div with a class name of space, the x of 4. And then these are basically going to be 2 links which you already have, so you can copy this link right here, paste it here. So this first link is going to be going into the /settings, and the button variant is not going to have a variant. The button rather is not going to have a variant, and then the text is just going to say update preferences. And then this second button, the link, is going to be going into the discover, and it's basically this button that we've just copied. Fantastic. Now let's go ahead and save that. Let's see what you have on the screen. And there we go. So if you were to click this, it will take you into a page that doesn't exist. So you'd get a 404 page. So before we handle all that, I think it will be prudent of us if we do the sidebar and then the header next. So let's begin with the sidebar.